We are going to start with the named functions. Name of the function must consist of alphanumerical characters and has to start with a letter, followed by letters, numbers, or underscores. You can use either camel or snake case for naming, same as with variables. The first function we'll look at will simply return a value we pass as an argument multiplied by 10. You can name your arguments whatever you like, but it is recommended that the name represents the data type you're passing in, if at all possible, obviously. So the name of the function will be multiply by 10. So to create a custom function, we start with the keyword function and then the name of the function. So multiply, and then I'm going to use camel case by 10. And I'm going to pass one argument, which will be number. And because I want this argument to be mandatory, basically, I'm not going to assign any default value. We could, if it was an optional argument, simply assign null to it, in which case, if we call this function without passing any argument, there wouldn't be any error thrown. But if we call this function the way we've just defined it, without passing the argument, the PHP parser will throw an error. So let's first try and return the value number multiplied by 10. And if we now try and echo the result in the browser, so echo, and in order to call this function, we simply need to provide the name of the function, and obviously because the argument is mandatory, we need to provide the argument as well. And I want to multiply number 10 by 10, so obviously we're passing 10 through as an argument. If we save the page, preview it in a browser, refresh the page, and fair enough, 10 multiplied by 10 gives us 100. So that's basically the basic structure of the function. You start with the function keyword, name of the function, then a set of brackets, you pass the argument, either one or more than one, and then we have curly braces around the whole logic basically of the function itself. You can have your curly braces in line and on the same line where the function is defined, or on a new line. I very often tend to use this approach, basically having the curly bracket after the definition of the function. So it's entirely up to you how you want this. Obviously, PHP parser, as you may remember, does not care about spaces or new lines, so you can use it either way. So now we've seen how the basic function works, how we can define the basic function, how we can pass an argument to this function and return a value. Let's now have a look at another example. I'm going to show you what would happen actually when we are not passing this argument, even though we know it is a mandatory argument for this specific function. So if we save it, preview it in the browser, refresh the page, and as you can see, we get this warning, missing argument 1 for multiply by 10. Now, we can also associate the default number with our argument. So rather than null, as I've suggested earlier, if we wanted to avoid it, which we obviously can do if I just save it now with the null by default, refresh the page, we get null, because obviously null as a 0, obviously integer, because null is casted to integer, obviously gives us 0 times 10 is just 0. Now we can also associate the specific value, let's say value 2. So if we don't pass any argument through, then 2 is going to be taken and multiplied by 10. So if we save it and preview it in a browser, refresh the page, and fair enough, we have 20 straight away. But if we do not associate any default value with the argument, then this argument is mandatory. And if we don't provide it, then we're gonna get the error, obviously. So that's how you can avoid this error if you want to obviously define any default value. Most of the time, I would imagine that if you are specifying function like this, where you want to multiply a number by 10, that you would probably have it as a mandatory argument, in which case you wouldn't associate any default value with it. Some function arguments can be type hinted. This way, if a different type of the argument is passed through to the function will produce an error. Currently, functions accept type hinting for arrays, callable as of version 5.4, and objects and interfaces, which we will cover in a future series when we'll talk about object-oriented PHP. There are plans to include scalar type hinting, such as integers and strings, but as of yet, PHP does not provide type hinting for these. Let's quickly have a look at an example. if we start and create a new function called return index of array, so let's type function and then index of array. And again, I'm using camel case here, but you are more than welcome to use snake case, which in this case would be index of array, but I prefer a camel case myself, so I'm just going to use this one. And what I'm going to use as a first argument is going to be the variable called array of the data type of array, basically, as well. So array keyword to type hint the argument, and then my variable name, so array, and I'm going to associate it with the default value of an empty array, so 2 square brackets or simply array and 2 brackets. I prefer square brackets. As you may remember, square brackets for the array are available as of version 5.4 of PHP. And the second argument, I'm going to use index, and by default I'm going to associate null with it. So it's not going to be, so it's going to be basically an optional argument. And now I'm going to start with index equals, and I'm going to check if the index is null. In other words, if it's empty, so empty, and I'm passing in the argument index, this empty function will tell me is index either null or false or 0. And if it is, then I'm going to associate 0 with it. Otherwise, I'm going to simply typecast it to integer. So inside of the brackets int to force the data type of the integer on this specific argument. So basically this index, even if someone puts in a string, let's say if I put something when calling this function, then this specific string will be casted to the integer. We've discussed typecasting in one of the previous videos, obviously. So as you can see here, we've got a simple shorthand for the if-else statement. First the condition, question mark, if it's true, do this, otherwise colon, do this, basically. So this is if else statement, basically. If is okay, do this. If it's not, then do that. So this is one of the ways that we could approach this. The other way would be to simply specify index by default 0, because obviously if it's null, if it's empty, we are returning 0 anyway. So we could do it this way and then simply use index equals and then typecast it to the integer and simply index and leave it this way. We could remove this one. Obviously when we are doing it using this approach, and I suppose this one would probably be a slightly better approach. The other way is to check whether whatever we're passing through as a second argument is an integer. So if we go back to the null situation here, and if we now check if, and there's a function, I'm going to use the space, exclamation mark, space to make it clear that I'm actually checking for the opposite of what I'm using here, the function of what I'm using. So it's is, and I'm checking for integer, int, the function, and then I'm passing the argument. So if it's not an integer, because I'm negating this function, if I wanted to check if it is an integer, I would simply remove this exclamation mark. But I'm trying to check if it's not, so I'm obviously using this negation symbol, which is the exclamation mark. And obviously you can use it this way as well, but just to make it a little bit clearer looking, so you can straight away see this exclamation mark, I'm just tend to basically keep these spaces in between. So if it's not an integer, that means someone put through the wrong argument, in which case we can simply terminate the code, the whole script. So we can use the die function and say argument is not an integer, for instance. So if we do it like this for the time being, and then we simply return array, and let's use this index. We could also check if the index exists, and we probably should do this. So let's, before this return, we're going to do another if-else statement. So we're going to check if array underscore key exists, and we first argument for this function is the key, so our index, and then the array which we received as the first argument. If it exists, return it, so question mark, and then return this index. Otherwise, return null, for instance. So now if we want to call this function, let's create an array of numbers. So numbers equals an array, and I'm going to put, let's say 0 is going to be 0. Then we're going for 1, 1, 2, 2. Then we have 3, 3. And I think for this exercise, this is going to be enough. And if we create a few new lines so we can see things a little bit clearer here as well. And now I'm going to simply echo using this function index of array. There we go. This is the one I'm interested in. And I'm passing the numbers as the first argument, which is the array. And then I want index 3 to be returned. If I save it and preview everything in the browser, refresh the page, and there we go, 3, index return 3. And how does it work? Basically, it takes obviously the key of this array, and obviously keys are on the left hand side, values are on the right hand side. That's why we check in array key exists in this array, and it does, because 3 is one of the keys from this array, which is this last one, and obviously that returned the value by using this array, putting the index 3, and then the value associated with it is what's been returned. And if we have a look at the other example, obviously we're going to check now whether this is going to be triggered if we pass anything that's not an integer. So I'm going to pass the string, let's say something, or let's use the keyword 3. If we save it, preview everything in the browser, refresh the page, and there we go. We've got argument is not an integer. And now just to show you actually that this is the warning, because this die, once this die function has been called, nothing else is going to be executed. So what's going to happen now, if I put anything after this line, say echo hello from the second line, and if we save it, preview it in a browser, refresh the page, you can see nothing. Once this die function has been called, nothing else is going to be shown. Basically, this whole script is terminated. So whatever is going to be after that is not going to be returned, basically. So whenever this die function is called, anything after the basically semicolon, which is obviously at the end of the statement, everything else is just going to be completely ignored now. Let's now try and test this first argument. We have type hinted this first argument, making sure that whatever is passed through is of the array data type. And we also associated an empty array as default. So if we don't pass the first argument at all, and if we ignore the second argument, then what we should get is pretty much just this die error, because it's not an integer. Null is not an integer, unless we specify basically do the default value as 0. Then this specific math function, if we call it without any arguments now, we should basically get null. We shouldn't get anything, because we haven't provided any array with any data, basically. So it's an empty array by default, and it checks basically, is it integer, the second argument, first of all, and it is, because 0 is obviously an integer, and we didn't override this argument, so this passes. Obviously nothing happens here. Then we check for this if array key exists at 0 index, basically, but because we have an empty array, there's not even a 0 index, so it does not, in which case it returns null. That's why when we call in this specific function without any arguments, we simply get null. But let's now try and put something else as the first argument. And as the first argument, I'm going to simply put some strings or sum. And if we save it, preview it in a browser, refresh the page, and there we go, we have catchable fatal error. Argument 1 passed to index of array must be of the type array string given, which simply tells us that obviously when we are type hinting, it's not typecasting, it's type hinting within the arguments, basically within the function. We have to basically whatever we put through as an argument has to comply. So if it's an array, if it's type hinted as an array, it has to be array. If it's anything else, we're gonna get this error, basically. So if I just put an empty array, if we save it and preview it in a browser, everything works fine. Obviously we still get null because we haven't got any values to work with, but it does work. As long as it's going to be an array, and as long as the second argument will be of an integer, because obviously we do this check here, then everything's going to be fine with this function. We obviously have learned that we also can typecast the callable. Let's have a look at now at the example of the callable.